Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
Good morning. Good morning. Boy, Richard, we should have raised ticket prices. Mr. Prime Minister, you're a good draw. Any event, I'm Bob Rubin, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you, both here in the room and also around the country and around the world via teleconference, to our Council of Foreign Relations meeting. We are exceedingly honored to have with us a very, very special guest, Gordon Brown, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. As is the practice of the Council, I will not recite from his resume, it's in your materials, but I would like to relate two brief anecdotes, which I think shed a little bit of light on our distinguished speaker. When the Labour Party was running to unseat John Major's Conservative Party, Gordon Brown, as the then, I guess, Shadow Chancellor, visited Washington. My Deputy Secretary, Larry Summers, told me, he said, this guy is really bright, he's really smart, he's really thoughtful, he's like us. I'm not sure he meant us. I think he meant something a little more limited, but in any event. He said, you really ought to meet him. So I was pleased to be thought to be up to that standard. So I met with the Shadow Chancellor, and indeed he was exactly what Larry said. And that was the beginning of a fabulous relationship. And when Gordon Brown became Chancellor, he worked very closely with Larry and myself, and after I left with Larry as Secretary, and it was really a remarkably good working relationship. Fast forward to 2-3 years ago, when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, he invited me to London to be with him as he was going to speak to some British business people, and I was going to say a word or two. And I said afterwards to people that it was really a remarkable speech. It was a sound and sensible path forward on economic policy, and it was remarkably candid and thoughtful on issues that American politicians find very difficult to talk about, trade, regulation, and the like. So, at a time when the global economy is struggling, as all of us know so well, through the most difficult stresses, I would say, since the 1930s, not only the UK, but the global economy is fortunate to have a leader of the extraordinary stature, effectiveness, thoughtfulness, and intelligence of Gordon Brown. The Prime Minister will begin our session with a few comments on meeting the new global challenges. Then he and I will have a little conversation, which will consist of my posing questions and his providing wisdom in response. Then we'll open up to questions from all of us, all the rest of all the people here, and also around the nation, around the world. This session will be on the record, and please turn off your cell phones. With that, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our friend, the Council's friend, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Gordon Brown.
I'm just going to speak at the front of the stage. Yep. Can I say, first of all, what a great privilege it is to speak to the Council for Foreign Relations, set up almost 90 years ago to bridge differences that existed in the world, to build links between America and Europe, and today producing outstanding work under Richard Haas's leadership. And so I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you today. This Council has been renowned for furthering debate on new ideas and new insights into both the world economy and our world society. And what we need now, in my view, is new ideas and new insights into how we can deal with what is a quite unique and unprecedented problem, which I describe as the first problems of the new global age. One of my predecessors as an economic advisor was John Maynard Keynes. And John Maynard Keynes did not have the same good fortune when he put new ideas to the British government in the 1920s and 30s. He produced what he called his solution to unemployment as early as 1929. He sent it to the Treasury where I was a minister before. When I arrived at the Treasury, I walked into the Treasury library for a day, and I found the copy of Keynes's book that he had sent to the Treasury for their ideas, with all the ideas that later should, in my view, have been adopted at the time. And on it was only 3 words from the British Treasury. The Permanent Secretary had written, inflation, extravagance, bankruptcy. And that is how Mr. Keynes was dealt with. When he came to Washington in the 1940s to produce his great plans for the IMF to be an independent central bank, he arrived at the US Treasury on his own, unaccompanied, just the sole representative of the British government's position. He met the Treasury Secretary, and the Treasury Secretary said, hello. He said, where's your lawyer? And he said, why haven't you brought your lawyer? And then the Treasury Secretary, who does your thinking for you? Now, I'm also delighted to be here with my old friend Bob Rubin, who's been a mentor to me over the years, and I'm very grateful for the time that he gave me, not only when we were in government, but when we were preparing for government, and he was very kind to us indeed. I suppose he got some of the similar advice that I got when I became Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Finance Minister. One of my predecessors sent me this note with 3 envelopes included inside it. And he said, look, things are going to get bad, then they might get worse, and then they might get terrible. If things get bad, open the first envelope. If they get worse, open the second. And if they get really critical, open the third. And so, as you do, the first crisis comes, you open the envelope, and you get pretty good advice. Blame your predecessor. The second crisis comes, and you get quite good advice. He said, blame the statistics. And then the third crisis gets worse and worse, so you open the envelope, and it says, start writing 3 envelopes to your successor. To your successor. Now, we are in what I believe is a unique set of events. I believe it is the first financial crisis of the global age. I believe it's also the first resources crisis of the global age. I believe what we've seen in the last 10 years is some of the great things that globalization can offer, which makes me positive about an open, free market, inclusive and sustainable globalization. We've seen cheaper consumer products available to millions of people who otherwise would not have been able to buy them as a result of the changes that have been taking place in manufacturing all the world. We've seen a period of low interest rates, partly as a result of the disinflationary effect of what has actually happened coming out of China and out of Asia. We've seen as a result many hundreds of thousands of people taken out of poverty in some of the poorest countries as a result of the development of these economies. But we have 4 problems that arise inevitably from the globalization of your economies, problems that were going to have to be solved anyway, but problems, if solved, can point to an opportunity-rich future. The problems are, of course, the restructuring of industries and services that have to take place. And I think we know ourselves that that is what is happening in our own countries at the moment. The second is, of course, the resources problems. We've had a period where there's been demand for all the resources higher than our ability to supply, particularly a growing Chinese, Asian, oil-producing countries' population wanting to have not only resources, but wanting to have better quality food and wanting to have access to all the commodities that we have access to. That is a problem that globalization will always have to deal with. We've got a third problem, and that is the gap between rich and poor countries. We've got to be very careful as people know what is happening around the world, that resentments don't build up, and we have a duty to do something about that as well. And of course, the fourth problem is the financial system, that we have now global flows of capital, global financial arrangements, but we don't necessarily have a global means of dealing with these problems between continents when they arise. Now, my view is an optimistic one. If we solve these problems, which are inherent in the move to a global economy, then we can be very optimistic about the future. Whatever happens in the next 20 years, I believe that the world economy will double in size. Simply the pressures in China, Asia and elsewhere, people becoming consumers as well as producers, the rise of some of the oil-producing countries, Africa, the world will double in its economic size in 20 years. And to put it one way, that's twice as many opportunities for good businesses to sell their products. Put another way, there's going to be 1 billion new skilled jobs in that world economy over these next 20 years. And what I see us doing at the moment, and perhaps it's giving a longer-term perspective to the present troubles we face, is that we've got the birth pangs of this new global order. We're having to deal with the problems of them. We're in the transition to what I believe is a more opportunity-rich economy for the future. And we have now, instead of just muddling through dealing with this crisis, as people think we are doing at the moment, we've got to show people that we're actually making the adjustments in the proper way to this global age. And if we are successful, I believe that American firms, British firms, with the great technologies that we have, with the high value-added goods and services we can produce, with the ingenuity of our scientists and innovators, we are extremely well placed to benefit from the expansion of the global economy in the years to come. But first, we've got to deal with these problems. Restructuring, it seems to me, we would be sending an illusion to people if we gave the impression that every job that is at risk at the moment is one that will always be there when this crisis is over. Instead, we've got to say to people, we cannot help necessarily, in some cases, you to keep the last job, but we will help you get the next job. And that's what a positive approach to an open, flexible, and inclusive globalization is about. When restructuring is taking place, we will help you with the skills you need, with the training opportunities you may not have yet, and with, obviously, dealing with all the other facilities and help and information advice people to get the next job. And that, in my view, is dependent on us remaining an open and not protectionist economy. If we have an open, inclusive, flexible and sustainable globalization, we can bring people to see the benefits of it. If it is simply open, free trade and flexible, then there'll be a protectionist reaction from people who feel they're not included. If it is not open, of course, it is simply protectionist in the first place. And I believe that the dividing line here is between an open society that is capable of trading around the world, benefiting from the openness that you have, against a protectionist response which is similar to what happened in the 1930s and totally unacceptable. So the restructuring must take place on the basis of helping people into the next jobs, but at the same time making sure that we keep our economy open. I think on resources, we're learning now that long-term demand for oil, commodities and food is going to grow, even although there has been a lull in the last few months. We've therefore got to have an energy and environment policy that is fit for the times. And I believe we've got to diversify out of oil into nuclear, is my view. Some may say that's wrong. Renewables, into persuading the oil countries to recycle their revenues, particularly into non-oil sources of energy investment in the longer term, so that we have a stable energy policy rather than a high and volatile oil price. And I believe, having talked to the Saudis and other countries in the OPEC states, this is actually possible. A coordinated approach from consumers and producers to give what we need, which is stability in energy prices. And I believe you solve three problems by doing that. The first problem is obviously the problem of the volatility of the oil price and its affordability. The second is obviously our climate change challenges, where we need to diversify out of fossil fuels, and therefore a huge climate change and environmental initiative is possible as a result of that and could be a huge job creator. And the third thing, of course, is the strategic problems. We've got to deal with strategic problems where we're dependent on volatile states for the supply of our energy. And if you could deal with these three problems by having coordination on the energy and environmental problems that we face, leading to Copenhagen next year, I believe we'd make a major advance in showing that we can work together to make globalization work. But the third problem is the one we're facing at the moment, and that is the financial sector issues. And when you see that share prices have gone down 40% in the year, when you see $1 trillion of write-offs taking place, when you see the slowdown and actually stalling of lending in different countries, when you see the number of banks that have had to be recapitalized, you know that we have, in my view, four big problems to solve in this area before we can say that we've got the global path to recovery that we need. We realized that liquidity was not enough. We realized that the other means of raising funding through sovereign wealth funds and through private equity and also through issuing shares to the public were not going to work to restructure and recapitalize our banks. So we made the decision to recapitalize our banks as a government, and I'm pleased to say that large numbers of countries around the world have recognized that that is the way to bring back confidence into the banking system. Now the problem we have to solve, and it's worth a debate on this in itself, is how we can get the resumption of lending that is necessary for small businesses to have the cash flow, people to be able, in new circumstances, to take out mortgages. Our problem, by the way, in Britain is not a shortage of demand for housing. We have not overbuilt, but that is an issue that's got to be solved, obviously, in different ways in different countries. So the first is the recapitalization of the system and the resumption of lending. And that is a priority for gaining confidence. The second is obviously making monetary policy work to best effect. And you in America have reduced interest rates to 1%. You probably know in the European area we've been slower to do so. It's 3.25% in the ECB, 3% in the United Kingdom. There is scope, therefore, as the Governor of the Bank of England has said, for further reduction in interest rates, and that is an essential element of what we are doing. But as Keynes recognized in the 1930s, when he talked about the problems of not being able to see the effective action, the effective response that he expected from interest rates, you've got to look at other means too. And a fiscal response is, in my view, in a situation where we've moved from high inflation last year to what will be low inflation, very low inflation indeed, as a result of the fall in the oil prices and the fall in food prices next year. To move from a situation of high inflation to low inflation makes it possible, I think, to argue that countries should be involved, if possible, in a coordinated fiscal and monetary stimulus. If possible, countries across borders agreeing that the fiscal stimulus they take will complement the stimulus in other countries, and then the benefits of the stimulus don't leak in the way that they have traditionally tended to leak, and you get the benefit being greater in individual countries from the action that is taken cooperatively together. Now, this is a huge debate about what works fiscally, whether it's tax cuts, whether it's public works investment, whether it's incentives for the lower paid who have a greater propensity to spend. But these are the issues that I think every country is now grappling with, that you need to coordinate the restabilization of banks and the resumption of lending with monetary policy that is active, but that will not work in itself unless it is now backed by fiscal stimulus. Germany announced a fiscal stimulus a few days ago. Equally, China announced a fiscal stimulus just before the meeting we're having in Washington. Australia's just not done so. Other countries around the world are doing so. And I believe the more we can coordinate that fiscal and monetary stimulus, the more we can give confidence that the economy can move forward. When Roosevelt said there is nothing to fear but fear itself, I think the corollary of that is confidence in the future depends on people being confident today. And we have got to ensure that we can build confidence through the actions that governments take. Now, the fourth area is, of course, the reforms in the international financial system and in our own domestic systems that are clearly necessary. The principles on which we will build the reforms, without going into the details, are, first of all, transparency, responsibility, people taking responsibility in the companies they're involved in, integrity, removing conflicts of interest in the system, sound banking practice is obvious, but also to try and build global financial arrangements that meet the needs of what is now a wholly global economy. And that's why we have been looking at the reform of the international monetary. And first of all, of course, it's got to help distressed economies from Hungary to Pakistan to now other countries like Iceland that have come to the International Monetary Fund for help. The World Bank has got to help those developing countries who face huge rises in oil and food prices. That is absolutely necessary. A world trade deal is absolutely crucial, in my view, to send a message that protectionism is unacceptable, and we're not going back to the problems of the 1930s. But we need to rebuild these international institutions, to have an early warning system so that we are better prepared for what happens, to have greater cooperation across borders between supervisors and regulators so that there is cross-border supervision where it is necessary, to have a better crisis prevention mechanism so that when things happen, the international community can come together more effectively. And that has been missing for some of the period in which we've been dealing with this financial crisis, to have a better surveillance of the world economy and therefore a better guide for countries in difficult to take action for the future. And I've no doubt that out of the discussions we're having, and I know you've got big study groups looking at this, we'll have an international financial monetary fund that looks more like an independent central bank. We will have a World Bank that looks like a bank for environment as well as development. And we will reform the relationships between the Financial Stability Forum, the Bank of International Settlements, and international institutions. But the whole purpose of this is so that we can better coordinate our actions to deal with the fact that we are a global economy. In 1933, the World Economic Conference was held in London. It was the conference that was supposed to bring the countries together to prevent protectionism and to deal with the problems together. That conference failed, and as a result of that, protectionism was rampant in the 1930s, and many of the other problems that we all know about flowed from it. I believe that international cooperation is absolutely essential, and I believe that the meeting in Washington is the first stage of a number of meetings that we need to have to deal with all these problems together. Not simply the global financial system, but the global energy problems that we've got to deal with, and of course, how we help with the restructuring of our industries and services over a longer period of time, and whether there is common action we can take them. Churchill once said, when the World Economic Conference broke down, that politicians were resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, and all-powerful for impotence. He also, by the way, said that politicians usually get things right after trying everything else. But the point I would make this morning, we have got to be resolved, we have got to be adamant, we have got to be determined. There is a way forward to an optimistic view of a global economy as it develops to serve us. We are in the transition to that better economy. Regard these as the problems that we have got to solve so that we have the stronger future that I believe is possible. But let us make sure that we work together, Britain and America, America and Europe, America, Europe and the rest of the world, to solve these problems together. Thank you very much.
That was terrific. Well, you can now see why I made the comment in my brief opening remarks that when you hear the Prime Minister speak, you do get a sense of somebody who really has his arms around the issue of the global economy and is extraordinarily sound, sensible, and I would say courageous in laying out a way forward. Let me ask you a micro question, if I may, Prime Minister. There's a little bit we were discussing before. How do you reconcile the call for stimulus, or rather for fiscal stimulus across many nations, with the current fiscal imbalances that your country has, and our country has, and a number of other countries have?
Well, first, they've got to be temporary. So you've got to be absolutely clear that these are temporary stimuluses that are necessary to take us out of this position that we're in, working with monetary policy. And secondly, you've got to have a sustainable path back to sustainable finances. So you've got a path back to sustainable finances. Now, I believe if you do these two things, then this is a necessary means of taking us through this difficult period of time. And I would like us to think, when we're looking at a fiscal stimulus, is what is necessary, not just to take us through the difficult times, but at the same time to build for what we need to do for the future. I mean, it's absolutely clear that if we're going to succeed in a global economy, education, infrastructure, technological infrastructure, science, innovation, all are going to be important, getting people who are unemployed and others with skills that are necessary for the future. And I would like us to be able to think of the policies that we're pursuing as at least in some cases contributing to that vision of a society where we have the value-added products based on high levels of skill and innovation. And what we're trying to do is to encourage ourselves along that path. If you look at Germany at the moment, Germany's got 55% debt as a proportion of its national income. It's got a fiscal stimulus. France is about 55% fiscal stimulus. We're about, at the moment, 37% of debt and national income. I think we can afford to do this, even though the current borrowing is high. And I think America's in the same position. Your debt's about 45%, excluding what you've had to do with Fannie Mae's and everything else. And I think you're in a position to take the action that is necessary. I think we've reached the stage where monetary policy must be accompanied by fiscal policy. And we can, I think, show that in a period where you've got very low inflation now coming next year, I mean, there's no doubt, unless things dramatically change, that some countries could have zero inflation next year, that this is not the time to prevent fiscal policy helping and supporting monetary policy.
And how would you? That's right. But how would you try to construct the link between that and a longer-term path as you described it?
That's the issue that we're looking at. Clearly, one area is in the environment, and obviously a lot of people are thinking about how you can make the changes that will make you more environmentally sensitive and more environmentally efficient, while at the same time taking people through this crisis. So, I mean, an obvious but very small thing is insulation of people's home, draft-proofing, building low-carbon homes, and taking that industry forward. Large numbers of jobs can be created in green industries and green technologies in the future. It could be for employment what IT was in the 1990s, a big expanding area of employment. But I think you've got to tailor your incentives properly for that to happen. To be honest, it would be far better if other countries were doing this as well. It would be far better if there was a coordinated approach to invest in environmental technologies, industries and skills, so that you can see the rest of the world responding to the climate change agenda as well. But I think there's a lot of scope for international talk on that. But other areas, transport infrastructure. But what people are looking at the moment is what we have learned from the past about what actually works as an immediate fiscal stimulus. Tax cuts, I think probably less than half your tax cuts a few months ago were spent, they were saved. public works, the time it takes to get public works projects up. These are all the issues that we've got to deal with. People with a propensity to consume, that is, lower income citizens, obviously are more likely to spend if credits are higher. These are all the things that we've got to look at. But again, I just say that the benefits of a fiscal stimulus, temporary as it's going to be, the benefits will be all that greater if other countries are part of it. And that's, I think, an important point that we've all got to recognise.
Let me ask you a different question, Prime Minister, sort of step back for a moment. Every economy has some balance between, or every modern economy has some balance between market-based economics and globalization on the one hand, and then the role of government performing the various purposes that markets by their nature can't perform. How do you think this crisis and everything around it is going to affect that balance across the world, the UK, continental Europe, the United States, around the world?
Well, we're a market economy, and nothing that we have
sort of
done.
a political question more than anything else.
Yeah, but I think it's important to say that having bought shares in banks to keep them going, we've got no intention of being permanent shareholders of banks. We want to pass these shares to other investors as soon as possible. So this is not an era when you're going to see governments, in my view, wanting, for ideological or other reasons, to take over and put into the public sector things that have been in the private sector for years. But I think what we're seeing is redefining of the relationship between the individual markets and state. I think that happened in the 1930s and 40s, and 30s in America, 40s in Britain. I think it's happening now. You see, for an individual, what they need to face the challenges of globalization is obviously going to be higher skills. I mean, the value of their labour is going to lie in their skills, and so government must have a role in making sure that the investment is available for education and for research and innovation, so that we get the best skilled, the best creative, the best innovative people. So the investments in education, in my view, are going to go up, and I would say that an economy that's not investing 10% public or private in education soon will not be an economy that's going to do as well in the future as others who are. I think the second thing is we're realizing there are strategic markets. So you cannot, in the long run, I think everybody would agree, have an economy that is wholly dependent on the volatile commodity of oil. And it's caused havoc in the last year. People's standards of living have fallen dramatically. Now, even although the price is down, the volatility makes people worried about investing, even if you're oil producers with massive resources. So we've got to do something about what is actually an imperfect market, the oil market, because there's a cartel, it's not actually a market. People are prevented from investing in different countries. There's so many rules that prevent others being involved in the decision-making process in OPEC. So we've got to look at oil as and energy as a strategic market, and I think we've got to look at financial services around the world as a strategic issue. So while it doesn't affect my view of the importance of market economies, it does affect my view of how we could better coordinate in those strategic areas, finance, energy, and I think food's another area where we've really got to look at what we can do, because it is absolutely, I mean, just one point, Africa is a net importer of food. Africa's got 70% of the population on the land. It is absolutely scandalous that the level of agricultural productivity in Africa is so low that they cannot even feed their own people with 70% of the people on the land. Now, if we could make it possible for Africa to become more productive with investment in food, then Africa could help feed the world. And these food shortages that have existed over these last few years, because we haven't made some of the big and bold decisions we should do about protectionism in food and subsidies in food, are something that I think we've got to deal with. So oil and food are examples where we've actually got markets that don't work well at all, and they should be working better.
Let me ask you two more questions, if I may. The first one is, in the time that you were Chancellor and I was Secretary, we worked together globally on crises in emerging market countries. Right. But when you get beyond that, there really isn't much evidence of effective global coordination, I would argue, in the economic arena.
Well, let me say, first of all, you were absolutely brilliant. The response to the Asian crisis, then to the problems in Latin America. I'm not as modest a man as Larry, you know. But,
we're into standards that I'm not going to discuss.
But you and Larry did a wonderful job. And these people forget that the last 10 years, we had the Russian crisis, we had the Asian crisis, we then had the IT bubble, we then had a Wall Street crash, you had a recession in America at the beginning of 2001. I mean, these are all problems that we've had to deal with, and this is a bigger problem. It's partly because we're a global economy that we've got these problems. They couldn't have happened in the same way in any other decade, just because of the nature of the global spread of the problem so quickly, and the fact you're dealing with global commodities like oil and food, and the fact that they have. Yeah, we're better at dealing with problems in individual countries, but I think we've got to learn, as they tried to do in the 1970s with Louvre and Plaza, not terribly successful in the end, but I mean the G7, G8, the G7 came together because of these problems, and we've got to get the right mechanisms, which is broader now than the G8, for dealing with these problems. But I sense, when talking to Premier Wen in China, as I've done on a few occasions, that they now are clear that they want to be part of this international order. Now that carries responsibilities as well as opportunities, but I think there is a chance that people are looking over the precipice, seeing what's actually happening, and now know that the cooperation that perhaps has been tenuous and not really been at a regular level in the way they should be, can now be made into a more permanent arrangement of continuous cooperation between people.
And just to wind that up, you think that will be institutionalized in some way that will involve countries ceding some degree of their sovereignty to some sort of international structure?
Well, in 1945, when the IMF and the World Bank were created, I mean, there was just massive optimism about what could be achieved, and people were prepared to say that prosperity is indivisible. They were prepared to contribute to the IMF, to give it powers to do things. You know, they said at the time, with these great visionary statements, that prosperity to be sustained had to be shared, and you had the Marshall Plan and its effect on Europe at the time as well. And I think we've lost sight of some of that visionary idealism, but we have got to see it restored, in my view, and people should be prepared to say, in the interests of a well-functioning global economy, where what happens in America affects everywhere else, and what can happen in the poorest country, in the poorest city, can affect the richest city, as we've known in the world here, that we have got to find a better mechanism for working together. So I still say the IMF and the Financial Stability Forum, you've got to have a reform there, but I think it could be done. And I know we've had these debates about that, because you were party to setting up the Financial Stability Forum with us in 1998. And then the World Bank, I think, could play a wider role as well. The fact is, these institutions were built for the problems of 1945. They were mainly balance of payments problems in individual countries. They were built for closed economies and sheltered economies. We're in a completely different world, and we should respond likewise to create these international institutions that mean something for what we've got to do: global flows of capital, global competition, and problems that can only be solved globally, as you know, with climate change and, to a great extent, this financial problem.
Yeah. My final question is this. If you go back, I don't know when it was exactly, but you'll remember better than I, you were having considerable political difficulty. Now, you're an acclaimed leader. No, you are, in the global community, in the UK. Yeah. So you've gone from having political difficulty to you really are, well, I'm repeating myself, an acclaimed leader both in the UK and around the world. How would you recommend the future political figures, when they have some difficulty, working their way through that and then getting to where you are today?
Just everybody should know that every politician will go through ups and downs. I actually think that...
Which is more fun?
if you can treat the downs with equanimity, you can enjoy the ups. But I think that there's two things happening, and people are clearly sceptical of whether politicians can actually come together to take action, and don't like divisive politics. You know that great line of Shelley talking about his grandmother applied to politicians, that people say they've lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. I suppose that the second thing is, I think one of the problems in politics is people taking the short-term view, and I think you really have got to take a long-term view. The question is, can you persuade the electorate that, you know, if you're going to succeed in a global world, if you're going to succeed, you've got to have better skills and invest in that, better science and invest in that, get a better planning system, more flexibility in your labour market, build your transport infrastructure. Now, all these are long-term decisions. You don't get an immediate payback the next day. And you've got to somehow persuade people that while, as Keynes said, in the long run we're all dead, the long run is still worthwhile investing in.
This convinces me we should rejoin the mother country, but anyway, be that as it may. We are now open to questions. Who would like to start us off? Way in the back. Yep.
Morning, sir. Kevin Owens. I'm here with the Council. Both of our nations have significant troop numbers in Afghanistan, and you've recently stated this remains of national interest to Great Britain, and the United States is going to increase their troop numbers in the coming months. If you would, for us, please define what that end state or success may look like in Afghanistan and what the keys to that success are.
Well, there are 41 countries part of the coalition in Afghanistan, and we shouldn't forget that the world has come together in the way that it didn't come together over Iraq to mount an effort to keep the Taliban out of power in Afghanistan, stop the Taliban and Al-Qaeda linking up as a concerted group, and therefore stopping what happens in Afghanistan arriving in the streets of America and in the streets of Britain. So to that extent, it's the front line against the Taliban and also the strengthening of Al-Qaeda. And I think we've got to do more to persuade public opinion that let Afghanistan go, and you will immediately have problems with both the Taliban taking power back in Afghanistan, but also with the Al-Qaeda strengthened for the things that they would want to do in other countries. Now, I think the problem in Afghanistan is it cannot just be a military solution. Afghanistan is a vast country. The governance of Afghanistan is still through tribes as well as through central government. We perhaps have got to have a better relationship with the local organizations that are actually working, while not having a relationship with those of the tribes that are associated with the drug trafficking. We've got to do more on the economic and social development of Afghanistan to give people a stake in the future. We've got this big dam project that will open up a great deal of irrigation and everything else. But there are economic and social initiatives got to take, and we've got to train the Afghan army and the Afghan police. I don't think that Afghan people, girls now in schools where they were banned from schools under the Taliban, people who suffered huge injuries and violence against them because they stood out against the Taliban. I don't think there's a popular will to have the Taliban back. But I think you've got to show that governance in Afghanistan is working both at a local and a national level. Now, our challenge is to persuade other countries to be part not only of the coalition, but of the burden sharing. America's the largest contributor of troops. Britain is the second largest contributor of troops. 3 countries have announced that they will want to pull their troops out by 2010, 2011. I think we've got to persuade people if we're going to succeed here, then it's got to be on the basis of burden sharing. And all countries that have got an interest in the future should be part either of the military action or supporting with equipment, helicopters and everything else, or helping with the doubling of the training of the Afghan army and making a police that is free from corruption. These are the problems we've got to deal with, and I think what you'll see in the next few months, and I think President Bush has already been starting this process of complementing the military action, which of course has had to change its tactics because of the way the Taliban are operating on a guerrilla warfare now, not head-to-head conflict, but guerrilla warfare with roadside bombs. Get our military position right, but complement that with economic, social, and actually political initiatives to work with the tribes to see if we can get to a better position in thwarting the Taliban. Now, just one other thing, we've got to solve the problem of the Pakistani-Afghan border in doing so.
This may sound like a strange question in this respect, follow-up. Is there any chance China would put troops in?
I think you've got to look at that as a possibility for the future. I think that's. I think 41 countries being in, not just NATO countries, obviously, countries from all over the world. I think people do see this as the front line against the return of at least a country that is totally taken over by a terrorist group.
Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. I'm Paula Broadwell at King's College London and Harvard University. My question is also about China. What role, you've been an advocate for China playing a larger role in solving or addressing the global economic crisis. Can you speak about the potential role that they could have and the challenges ahead for China?
I had the pleasure a few months ago being in China of hosting with Premier Wen the first town hall meeting that he had ever had. And I know that the British press, when they came, were quite cynical about how it went. But the questions that were coming to Premier Wen were about poor housing, about inadequate health services, about lack of opportunities in education. And he was clearly taking this incredibly serious. And he says that the great achievement is to have taken 100 million people out of poverty. Now, China's domestic interests is to maintain a high rate of growth, to take large numbers of people out of poverty, to accommodate the people who now want to move from the rural areas to the cities. And if people are in the cities and towns working in this huge production and manufacturing sector that they've got, then it's in their interest not to have them laid off or unemployed as a result of what's happening around the world. So the domestic interest of China is to cooperate in maintaining high levels of economic growth. Now, that's the beginning of the discussion. There are issues about the exchange rate. There are issues about how far, even with the last package, they've expanded domestic demand. But the fact that Premier Wen could announce a few days before Washington this $586 billion package, a determination to show that China was determined to expand its domestic demand, as we have been requesting to, and I've been phoning him about this and others have been phoning, shows that China wants to be a part of the global solution to this problem. Now, as you know, there are many issues that arise, human rights and other issues, but I think the important thing is that China wants to be part of this new international order. And I do say, for us in America and Europe, this is the time to change the international order, to bring it up to date. 10 years, 20 years from now, it might look a very different picture. But I think India, China, and the oil-producing countries want to be part of the order that is basically similar to what we created after the Second World War, but updated by dealing with all the new challenges. And I think this is an opportunity we should not miss. 10 or 20 years ago, from now, it might look very different. And China and India may feel that they want to dictate the terms of it in a different way.
Stanley? Microphone.
Prime Minister, how has the election of Obama, in your view, changed the perspectives of other people around the world about America, if at all?
It's certainly changed people's views of America. I don't want to enter into the party politics of this, as you know. I did a very good conversation with John McCain yesterday, and I think he was incredibly dignified in his acceptance of defeat, and in a way that characterizes a man who has done a great deal of public service, for which I know your country is proud. But Barack Obama has inspired a younger generation, not just in America, but right across the world, with an interest in political debate and political argument. I think people see Barack Obama reaching out to the rest of the world, and that's incredibly important. He spoke in Berlin about building one world where people were united. And obviously, we look forward to working with him on the domestic economic policies in our country and in your country, to see what common ground can be built up over a period of time. But you know, you have a constitution says that all men are created equal, that every American should have the opportunity to reach the top. You have proved to the world in the most dramatic way in the last few weeks that is a reality in your country. And I think everybody is proud of what America has been able to do.
Jay?
Thank you. Excellency, your diffidence about meddling in American politics aside, the world has a great interest in American economic policy, and given the protectionist pressures that attend the new administration, I wonder if you can speak to what you think is the appropriate world or international response to those pressures.
Well, I'm very grateful for that question, because I do think it is really important that we send out a signal that protectionism today would be the road to ruin. If we got ourselves into a position where countries made their own decisions irrespective of what's happening anywhere else, a world trade deal didn't happen, lots of people were then just violating the trade agreements we've had in the past, none of the trade agreements could move forward, then you will see the same problems that happened at other times when protectionist sentiment was very high. Now, I can see why people take protectionist attitudes. The immediate fear is losing your job. The fact that you're getting cheaper consumer products or that the interest rates have been lower is not as direct as the fact that in an industry which is competing with an industry abroad, you are faced with the prospect of losing your job. So I can see these threats, and I can see how it is possible to build up a very strong protectionist campaign and say no other country should be outdoing us by false subsidies and everything else. And I was telling the story a few weeks ago, being in Washington for one of the IMF meetings, Bob, There was a banner outside with the demonstrations that were taking place, and it said, "Worldwide Campaign Against Globalization." And you can see what people mean, that they're worried about the effects on their life. In France, it was a bit worse. They had one of these demonstrations for protectionism, and it said no. It was in 2006, and it said no to 2007. but you can see the why people react in that protectionist way. But for the better future of all our countries, a world trade deal would send a massive signal that the world could come together to try to solve its problems. Now, the benefits flow to the developing countries, some of the poorest countries in the world. There is no major sacrifice that I believe Europe or America has to make. There are sacrifices, but not major. And yet the benefits of sending out that message that we've rejected protectionism, the benefits are very, very big indeed. And it would show the world was able to cooperate. Now, it so happens that the disputes about the detail are actually more or less sorted out. There is not many issues that require to be sorted out. There was a dispute between India and America. There's some worries about some aspects of services and cotton, but these are issues that can be sorted out. If you could announce a world trade deal within the next few months, people would then have what's been missing. It's the most precious asset of all. It's confidence about the future.
Let me ask a question that came in from, there are participants around the world, as I mentioned. This is from Stephanie Klein Albrunt, International Crisis Group, Beijing, China. It goes to the question, the point you raised about Africa. Following this week's deployment of Angolan troops to the crisis Democratic Republic of the Congo, what steps can the UK take to prevent a wider regional war? And maybe that's a more general question, Mr. Prime Minister, about Africa and what UK and the rest of the industrial world, and the rest of the world more generally, can do to try to help in Africa.
Well, it's a tragedy that 850,000 people have been displaced in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And people fear that the events in Rwanda a few years ago with the tribal tensions are going to affect the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are now 17,000 peacekeepers. We have just provided some money so that can go up to 20,000 if other countries are able to contribute. The peacekeeping group needs to be led, but in the end you need a political solution. President Kagame of Rwanda and Kabila of the DRC, and I think the international pressure will grow. Obasanjo has become the UN envoy. This is a conflict that is avoidable, and it's got to be solved by a political intervention. And I think in Africa, right across Africa, Sudan and Darfur, Zimbabwe, these are tragedies where you want the African Union to be stronger in its ability to deal with these problems themselves, but you also need the United Nations support to do so. Africa has actually grown quite fast over the last few years in general terms. There's some great countries in Africa that are making major reforms and doing far better. So one of the pictures of Africa is one of optimism, but the problem is 40 million children are still not going to school. You've got children dying in childbirth completely unnecessary because of inadequate health care. You've got one mother dying every minute in childbirth, the time that should be the happiest time of her life becoming the saddest as the mother dies in childbirth, and all these things are avoidable. If you take Sierra Leone, 6 million people, 80 midwives, 200 nurses, and 100 doctors. You cannot run a healthcare system. 1 in 8 mothers die in childbirth. Now, these are problems that can be avoided. And my deal with Africa would be open up, stop corruption, be ready to trade with the rest of the world, but we will help you with education, with support for microcredit and economic development and health. And that seems to me to be a deal that could actually work. I do say to this American audience that if we don't act together on Africa, China, there are 900,000 Chinese workers in Africa at the moment. China is buying up the resources of Africa. But there's another more insidious problem, and that is Al-Qaeda moving down into Somalia and into other countries in Africa with terrorist cells. And I was at a school in Nigeria, in Abuja, just outside Abuja, and there was these kids in a pretty dilapidated school, wanting to learn and to be educated, very keen. In fact, when we went round them and asked them, they all wanted to be engineers and nurses and doctors and everything. Nobody wanted to be a politician, by the way. But they had all the ambitions that every child has. but they were in totally dilapidated conditions, three to a desk. And then they told me that up the road, there was a madrasas that had been run by one of the violent extremist Islamic groups, ready to offer free education to kids, but of course the condition was indoctrination. Now, if we don't provide education and help provide that education in Africa, then others will. And that's why I'm very pleased that for President Obama, the investment in education for all is one of his priorities. If we can help Africa educate its people and then have a level of economic development, they can make a huge contribution to the food problem, to solving climate change, and to the economic development of the world.
Any thoughts, Prime Minister, on how to reduce corruption and improve effectiveness of governance?
I think some of the transparency initiatives, you know, for the oil and energy industries, a requirement on companies to be transparent about the transaction. I mean, look, when I came into government in 1997, British law had been so affected by corruption around the world that we even gave tax reliefs for bribes. we did change that, but that was the way it used to be. And I actually went to a conference in Mauritius and then went over. It was the first time I'd been when I became Chancellor to Madagascar. I'd just made a speech with others about how to eliminate corruption from Africa. I arrived at Madagascar airport with this plane that had to refuel. And the guy at the airport refused to allow us to refuel unless he got a bribe. I'm afraid that was but that's got to be stamped out by these transparency initiatives and by making it a condition of funding for the countries that they have actually got. They have actually got to clean up the financial system, particularly their public expenditures. And I think the IMF and the World Bank can play quite a big role in that. And increasingly, you know, people in Africa are not going to vote for leaders who are corrupt. I mean, that is one of the lessons of recent years. We've seen the changes in Liberia. We've seen changes happening in Kenya. We see changes where, of course, if there had been a fair election in Zimbabwe, you would have had a new person there as well.
I think we have time for, we always end on time at the Council, and we're scheduled to end at 9, so we'll either have 1 or 2 questions depending on what happens. Ma'am, right there.
Catherine Grover, American University. Prime Minister, I wondered if you had mentioned the Copenhagen meeting. I wondered if you could describe the principles that you see in a post-2012 climate agreement.
I think the issue for Copenhagen is that there is general agreement on a 2050 target. We are saying 80% cuts in emissions, but there's general agreement that there will be that target. The question is, what is the agreement for the years 2020 and 2025? And that's where the debate was at the G8 when I attended it in Japan. That's the debate that's taking place in Europe at the moment, because, you know, Europe is a combination of the old Eastern European states who've got lots of coal-fired power stations and have got lots of problems therefore in diversifying out of less efficient sources of energy. So the agreement will have to be about what you can do to 2020 and 2025, and that's where the big argument, I think, has got to be resolved. But I'm more confident with both what President-elect Obama and John McCain said in the election campaign, that they want to see America very much part of these reductions. I think we've got to consider the financing of this, because it's going to be a very big problem. If you say to a developing country or an emerging market country, you've got to cut your emissions by X, but provide no means by which they can do it, then you've got to find a way of financing what is a less cheap form of energy development, given that you've made this policy decision to move out of, say, coal into nuclear or into something else. So we have got to have a means by which we can finance the implementation of a Copenhagen agreement, and that's why I'm attracted to the World Bank having a role in loans or in grants, but particularly loans to emerging markets and developing countries. So you need a system of clear targets. You need to have them quite specific for what people have got to do, not just in the long term, but in the medium term. And you need to find a way of financing the changes that you're expecting other countries to make in energy. And of course, the whole idea of a carbon market is actually really exciting, because a lot of these changes can be made by market incentives. And I think that's where most countries now want to be. So these are the challenges. I'm optimistic that we can meet them. And I do feel in some way that the way out of this economic set of problems we face for employment and for new businesses – it is going to be in the encouragement of energy efficient businesses and services.
Prime Minister, we thank you enormously, and as I said in my remarks, it's not only the UK but the entire globe that is very fortunate having you as a leader.
Well, you did very kind. Really.
Thank you for watching this Council on Foreign Relations video. For additional audio, video, and transcripts of CFR meetings, as well as expert analysis of international news, please visit us online at cfr.org.